session, GitHub and Azure DevOps Duet, Future Data-Driven Edition. It's about how a development team and an operations team must start working together for data platform deployments.
So for the next 60 minutes or so, we'll be talking about Azure DevOps and GitHub. We're going to be figuring out how to use both together to do the full application management lifecycle, from creating a work item all the way to its release. And we'll be discussing both the cloud and on-premise versions of them both, as well as the features we think are most suitable for source control, the boards, the CI/CD pipelines, the packages and test plans. And pending the time, we will do the demos as well, including demos for GitHub code spaces and deploying the database updates using those features. And at the end of the session, you will have a basic understanding of some of the features in both GitHub and Azure DevOps, and how you can use them to do for your data platform deployments.
Yeah, and by the way, everybody, there's a good reason why we use a period to represent code spaces, or as I was raised to call it, a full stop, as you will see later in this session. So, Sander, before we go any further and maybe get a bit too carried away, shall we introduce ourselves?
Yeah, shall we? So I'm Sander. I'm a SQL Server DBA from the Netherlands. I have over 20 years experience in IT and more than 15 in SQL Server. I'm a Cloud and Data Center MVP, and I'm a major contributor to the DBA Tools project. I work for Data Masterminds, which is a company based in the US. We do a lot of consulting for other companies with database issues or management. You can find me on Twitter. I have a blog. If you have any questions after the session, feel free to send me an email. All the demos you'll see from me today will also be available on my GitHub page. Just go to the presentations repository, find this session, and you will have the demos right there. That's just to get that question out of the way. The demos are free for you to use, change, or reteach. So they're yours to do whatever you want to do with them. And now Kevin has a slightly more complicated bio than me. So go ahead, Kevin.
Oh, thanks for that, Sander. And on that note, my name is Kevin Chant, and I'm a lead BI analytics architect living in the Netherlands. However, some of you may be able to guess from the accent, I'm originally from the southwest of the UK. However, I live in the Netherlands due to the fact my wife is Dutch. So basically, I'm an Englishman living in the Netherlands, working for a French-based company because he met a woman in Australia. Now, whenever I say this out loud, I realise why Sander says this is complicated. Now, I've worked in IT since the days of Windows 95, and that's probably as much as I should say about that. And over that time, I've worked in various sectors, including the banking, oil and health insurance industries. In fact, I've supported companies that are in the top 10 of the Fortune 500 list. And over that time, I've gained various certifications, including both the new and the old style MCSE. And more recently, I became a Microsoft certified DevOps engineer expert, which is fairly relevant for this session. And in addition to that, I'm a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. And you can find me in a couple of places on social media. And as you can see on my bio, I've got my own blog. And I do have some things that are related to this session in my GitHub repo as well. So now we've got that out of the way. To give this session a bit of context, one of us is from the SQL development team and the other from the SQL operations team. Our manager has decided that both teams will merge into one DevOps team, so that we're all one big happy family. Now, our development team has been heavily using GitHub for a while now, and the same goes for Azure DevOps as far as our operations team is concerned. And after much debate within the team, they've actually asked us to come up with a solution on how to use both together effectively. to get the most out of both offerings.
In reality, this is a real gradual process. However, since this is only a 60-minute session, we've taken it upon ourselves to speed up this process. In addition, our manager has decided that the development team lead will be the Scrum Master and the operations team lead will be the product owner.
So for those of you who don't know, a product owner is responsible for translating business needs into workable backlog items for Scrum sprints, which means they must speak to stakeholders at various levels within the business. And they are ultimately responsible for prioritizing those items, even though they may get input about those priorities from various stakeholders and members of their own team.
And the Scrum Master's role is to empower the team to do those backlog items by encouraging how they work and remove any impediments if they appear.
Yeah. Now, when people think of using Azure DevOps or GitHub to work in a DevOps related way with the Microsoft data platform, they tend to think of using infrastructure as code to deliver a group of services together, like in this diagram here on the screen. And the services you actually see here are in fact the suggested services from Microsoft for their solution idea for advanced analytics. And if you go online, you'll find they got various solution ideas. So as you can see in this diagram, it goes across in what's called a deployment pipeline to deploy services to a development environment, and then a few other environments afterwards. However, we're also being expected to deliver other things using Azure DevOps and GitHub together as well. For example, the expectation is there that we're going to use them to deliver database deployments. So that we do Cicd for things like, for example, new tables that are added to a particular database, as you can see in this diagram, where it goes across from development to integration automatically and then to UAT, and then may or may not be after an approval to be deployed to production. And as well as SQL database, of course, the same applies for various other services as well. And these are the challenges that we're facing at the moment implementing DevOps, isn't it? Aren't we, Sander?
Yes, we are.
So on that note, we should discuss whether we're going to keep using both services in the cloud or install the server versions for both instead. Personally, I prefer to use the on-premises versions for security and reporting purposes. However, the downside is we'd have to deploy both services on multiple servers for business continuity reasons. Plus, we may have to wait a while for new features because of the cloud-first strategy. In addition, Sander, we'd have to maintain and patch all the servers we deploy as well.
But if we use any of these services in the cloud instead, you wouldn't have to patch or maintain anything because it's all done behind the scenes for you. And it's easier to install extensions from the marketplace for both Azure DevOps and GitHub Actions for GitHub with the cloud version.
That's true, and we can still secure them anyway. Besides, whichever we use, we must still consider security and compliance because we've got auditors that we have to keep happy. Luckily, of course, both Azure DevOps and GitHub are well structured and easy to manage.
Remember, if we use a cloud-based product, we have more versions to choose from.
Well, I know for Azure DevOps, there's only two versions, which are Azure DevOps Cloud Services and Azure DevOps Server, which used to be called TFS. So what GitHub versions are available? Because I thought there was only the free version or enterprise to choose from.
Oh, there's more than a couple, Kevin.
Well, now you've mentioned it, you kind of nominated yourself to list all of them, I think, right now. And since we're on Teams, feel free, anybody, to guess how many there are in the chat before Sander starts listing them off.
Give him a couple seconds.
Well, my chat seems to be muted. Ah, there you go.
Well, I'll start mentioning them anyway. So The first one we have is GitHub free for user accounts, which is the version you're probably familiar with. That is when you first register for GitHub. Then there is GitHub Pro, which is an upgrade for your personal account, which comes with a couple extra features like pull request reviewers. Then we have GitHub free for organizations, which include features like team discussions, which is a really handy feature to collaborate with other members of your team. And this version is actually good for entry-level teams. Then there's GitHub Team, which introduces a lot more features for instead of the GitHub free for organizations. For example, just like with GitHub Pro, you get pull request reviewers. We then have GitHub Enterprise, and this is the first version that is actually available for both the cloud and on-premise. It has GitHub Connect for unified contributions, and it's easier for you to manage your billing for multiple GitHub organizations. Finally, there's GitHub One, which is also available both on-premise and in the cloud. And this is all the features of Enterprise, along with additional support, insights, and advanced security.
Hang on a minute. How can security in GitHub Enterprise get any more advanced?
Well, it allows you to do to use features like we use in public repositories for code scanning and dependency reviews, for instance, and those are available in your private repositories then as well.
Useful to know, and just for the benefit of everybody, I'm just going to put a link to the different GitHub products in the chat.
Anyway, I know we can configure authentication on Azure DevOps Cloud Services or GitHub Enterprise to store repositories for some Azure data engineering services like Azure Synapse Analytics. So the main points we want you to take away from this section is there are multiple versions of both products, including some very good free versions that you can use. And if you install the on-premise version, you have to patch and maintain everything yourself, whereas with the cloud-based version, everything is done behind the scenes for you. Plus, you need OAuth 2 integration to easily integrate services like Synapse Studio and with an Azure DevOps repository. So I need to get that out.
Wait, when your first language is something else, it can be a bit of a tongue twister. So
yeah.
Moving forwards, we want to quickly show you how Azure DevOps is structured. So let's quickly go to that now. So as you can see here, and you probably want me to do Control+ so you can all see it better. If anybody thinks this is still not big enough, then feel free to put in the chat, and I'll obviously zoom in a bit more. Anyway, Azure DevOps has its own structure, and as you can see here, it's got its own hierarchy. Here is the icon that represents your account, and on the left-hand side, you can see that the various organizations that your account's connected to. Now, these organizations can be the company you work for, or if you work for a large enterprise, it can be just a division within them, or it can be one you've created for testing purposes. And if you have the right permissions, you can actually change various settings at the organization level. And if you don't have the right permissions, some enterprises actually still let you view these settings so you know what's where. And as you can see, there's quite a few different settings here you can look to change. However, we won't be going through them all in this session. So each organization can contain one or more projects, as you can see here. And if I click on one of these projects, you can see that there's actually default services that comes with Azure DevOps on the left-hand side, including Azure Boards, Azure Repos, Pipelines, Test Plans, and Artifacts. And just like with the organization settings, you can actually change project settings as well if you have the right permissions. And this is the settings that tend to be more common for people to be able to change in teams, especially data platform teams, because people need to manage their projects and their way of working. And again, we won't go through all of these here either. However, I will quickly show you that you can actually change some user settings here as well, and these can be fairly useful.
I have a question, Kevin.
Yeah.
So is there a way we can manage which of the services a project uses in Azure DevOps?
Indeed, and luckily I didn't click away from this screen, because if I scroll down in the overview screen, you can see that I can actually turn the various different services on and off.
Cool. Awesome. So we better quickly discuss the settings that we have in GitHub. So I'm going to share my screen because I am going to do that. So this is where I would normally land if I go to my GitHub page. This has some of my personal settings. This is where most of you will spend your time if you want to change anything in your personal settings. So that is one of the things I want to show you is that in your account, you can change a couple of things in your username, and what you might also see in other settings as well. If you have anything security related settings that you want to make sure that MFA or 2FA in this case is enabled. So the same thing we can do something like this for the organization. So if we go to the organizations and then go to the settings, fortunately I already have that open. We have the same kind of settings. This kind of depends on which version of GitHub you're running, but and I'm not going to go through all of these settings because you are perfectly capable to go through them yourself, because it will take too much time to go through everything. In addition, we have something called projects in GitHub as well, even though we do have they have a slightly different purpose than you're used to, and I'm going to show you that. So these are projects within GitHub. And again, if we open that, there are settings for that as well. So yeah, that's about it. So that's my GitHub demos for settings.
Good. So there's other things as well, some that we can configure if we dive into even deeper into all these different settings, and that's why we obviously skim through them quickly, because as you all saw, there's quite a fair few. And what we can realize from going through this, Sander, is that we can configure the settings in both to suit our needs.
So the main point we want you to take away from this section is how both of these products are structured with their features and their settings.
Yeah, and I'm just going to take back the screen a minute. So
anyway, now we've covered the main admin stuff. Let's decide which one of the version control options we're going to use.
You mean whether we're going to use Azure DevOps or GitHub, or can we use SourceSafe?
Well, I actually worked with this product in the past, and I'm really happy that Microsoft discontinued services with that. So, well, maybe something a little bit more modern.
Well, Azure DevOps includes a service called Azure Repos, and I can actually quickly show you this now. So here, for example, if I click on Repos, I can actually, if I press Control thing just to minimize it. So basically, this is just a visual representation of your Git repository in Azure Repos, which is one of the services within Azure DevOps. Now, if I click on Repos again, let's expand this out so you can see there's various features that comes by default within Azure Repos. So you can view commits, pushes, your branches, so tags, for example, and of course, pull requests. And not only can you view your Git repositories here, but it also supports Team Foundation version control, Sander. So maybe Azure Repos would be the better option.
Maybe, but the last time I checked, everybody in the team is using Git. So this really hooks in nicely with other tools from Microsoft like Visual Studio and Azure Data Studio. And I think people will see a very interesting version of the Visual Studio Code if they keep watching our session. So plus how Azure DevOps Studio looks later on. So, and to be honest, Kevin, a lot of us developers use GitHub heavily. So if we go over to GitHub, you can actually explain the layout a bit.
Okay then, so here's your standard GitHub repository. So as you can see, again, it's a visual representation of a Git repository. Our Git is the only version that GitHub supports. The clue for it is, of course, in the name. I seem to have, I was just checking, I thought we had our hands up for a moment, but we don't. So yeah, so it gives you all the main information, a bit like Azure Repos, but it shows it here in the main screen. Now you have other parts as well within your repository. You have issues, so you can view any issues that people raise to do with your repository in here. Pull request. As you can see, we've enabled discussions for this particular repository, which is something new, which is recently gone GA for GitHub, which is quite a good feature. So you can have full-on team discussions within here, and it's worth looking into. There's this Actions tab, and I do believe we'll see more of that later in this session. Projects, like Sandra suggested, you can work with projects in various repositories as well. Wiki, security, highlights, and settings. So that's very quickly how it all looks. However, whilst we're in this repository, we can enter a raffle. Whilst we're in this repository, well, everybody can. Whilst we're in this repository, we thought we would do a Code Spaces demo here. So within this GitHub repository, in any repository that you're in GitHub, you can press what is called the period, or some of you may call it the full stop, and that will actually open up Code Spaces. And we'll see how fast it loads. Now we're live, and here you go. It's actually quite quick. So this is basically a development environment in the cloud directly from within GitHub, which means you don't have to set up a dev environment on your machine anymore if you don't want to. Just press the period when you're in your GitHub repository, and this will load up. And as you can see, this is literally your code here. This probably looks a bit familiar to some of you as well, because there's actually a version of Visual Studio Code, especially designed for use in the cloud. And you can see some of the common Visual Code features on the left-hand side. Now you can install extensions, but it's a bit limited at the moment because obviously you need the full functionality of Visual Studio Code for some extensions. But this is very handy to look at. And like we said, we think this is pretty cool. So we wanted to demo this today. So that's something for you all to experiment with after this session. Go to your GitHub repository, just press the period and see what happens. Anyway, going back to your code, Sander, now we've done that. It would only be for your development work though, right? Working with the code, because it sounds like version control would be complicated for the ops folks to learn.
Well, actually, I think when you will see when ops teams start using version control, they will actually start to perform better. I've seen this at previous companies where I worked for, and in my current company as well, that if we put our scripting in source control, it can be shared throughout the IT department, for instance, and that is an efficient way to keep track of any changes and to get all the scripts to everybody within the department.
Okay, so what about branching strategies? Because I hear they're pretty important.
Yeah, so there are various ones that we can use. The most common ones that people use is the Git flow and the GitHub flow.
Well, what's the main difference between those two? Because they sound pretty similar to me.
Well, the major difference between the two is that with the Git flow, you don't directly merge into the main branch unless it's a hotfix. So there's always something like a development branch or a dev branch for short. With the GitHub workflow, there is no development branch. So there are only feature branches, and any feature gets merged into the main branch right after it's successfully tested. So that's the main difference.
So can we use both of those in Azure DevOps or GitHub?
Sure, we can use both of them in both solutions. And us devs have been using source control for many years. So if you do something like pair programming between dev and ops members, they can actually get used to either products very easily.
Okay, so what's to stop somebody coding their own release and pushing it straight to the main branch?
Glad you asked. So that is pretty important. It looks like both products have something called branching policies. One of which is that two people have to approve updates to the main branch.
So that sounds good, and I think we need to do that to be SOX compliant anyway, since we deal with financial data. So I'm guessing the big question is going to be, which do we use? Do we use Azure Repos and Azure DevOps, or do we use GitHub Repositories?
Well, before we decide that, why don't you check something for me? If you use the search, there are millions of repositories in GitHub, including the ones from Microsoft and for workshops and SQL Server documentation. Plus the DBA tools module, which most of the DBAs that are on the data platform will probably know by now. And it's easy to fork any of these repositories to submit changes to the original version.
Well, now you've pointed that out, I suppose we should use GitHub for our repositories.
Yeah, it's pretty fast, right? So anyway, there are a few main points we want you to take away from this section about version control. Azure DevOps supports 2 version control options. They both have TFVC and Git, and GitHub doesn't support any other version control option than Git. Git has become the de facto standard nowadays, so if you have the choice, just go for Git, in my opinion. In addition, you can secure updates using branching policies in both Azure DevOps and GitHub.
So I think we better discuss how we're going to organize our backlog items.
Well, in GitHub, we tend to deal with so-called issues for each repository, and you showed that in one of the demos earlier. And people add their issues in the repositories and then deal with them there. We can put a level of automation on them, and it's really simple to use, actually. And people have been using this in GitHub for years.
So if you want to do more planned work, I'm guessing that we're going to have to work with projects. So how does that work in GitHub?
Well, let's go and go to the project. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. So if we go to projects, we can actually, as you saw earlier in the items in GitHub, we can create, let's see, we can create a new project. And one of the things that we can do is use templates. And these are very handy. We can use something like basic Kanban, automated Kanban. And like I said, we have automation in issues. So we can use tags or labels. In GitHub, we call it labels to do automation. Automated Kanban with reviews and bug triage as well. So that is kind of how we can do that with projects, and you can assign any issues to a particular project.
Yeah.
Very easy.
Whilst you'll talk about projects at the moment, just to add to the confusion, Sandra, as well, it's worth mentioning that GitHub announced that they were going to introduce GitHub Issues a while back, which will be their way of an alternative way of managing work items. Now, just to avoid any confusion, when GitHub Issues is different from issues that you work with in the GitHub repositories, it's an actual new feature in its own right. However, we can't show you how it looks at this moment in time because it's only in private preview, and me and Sander, unfortunately, are not on the list to be able to show it. However, it's worth keeping an eye out for when it's released, and I will put a link about it in the chat as well. So, bear with me. Well, so here, carry on. Sorry.
Yeah. Anyway, I've heard a rumor you spent 2 hours answering questions about Azure DevOps before, so you might about Azure Boards. So you might as well tear the band-aid off and show us what it can do.
Okay then, this is a very fast run through Azure Boards, just so because otherwise, yeah, as Sandra said, I spent 2 hours answering questions about it once. So basically, this is Azure Boards, and this is how the servers in Azure DevOps to manage your work items. And in fact, if I expand this a bit, I will be able to show you the default features that actually comes with it as well. So you have work items, and I'm just going to see you assuming that will let that pin there. So you have work items, which allows you to work, shows you all your work items in a linear format. You have boards, which allows you to work in a Kanban or Scrumban kind of way. So some of you may find this very similar looking to other board management systems. You have backlogs, which allows you to view all of your outstanding backlog items. So for example, if you're working with Scrum and you've got all your Scrum product backlog items here, this will show you all the ones that are left to still be done. Talking about Scrum, if you look on sprints, you have a sprint task board, which is very useful for when you're working in the sprints. And then finally, you have queries, and this is where you can actually query the work items you've got in Azure Boards. So for example, if you want to find work items which don't have a certain tag, you can run a query to find it like here. And if I click on editor, you'll see it's got a query designer, which is very similar to other query designers that have come with database solutions over the years.
I have another question, Kevin.
Oh, what's that?
Yeah, how are the backlog items organized for Scrum here?
Well, if we go back to the backlogs and I click on epics, I can quickly go through this. So the hierarchy by default is that each board, which by default has one or more epics, which has one or more features, which then has one or more backlog items. Now, if we're using the agile process instead, you would actually have user stories instead of product backlog items. And for those of you who are wondering how to view the different processes used by projects, that is in an organization setting here under boards. It's the only one. It's called process. So I just thought I'd quickly show you that as well. By the way, Sander, did I mention all the analytics and preview features we can potentially use with Azure Boards?
You have only 60 minutes, Kevin.
Okay, well, in that case, I'm just going to very quickly mention to everybody that in Azure DevOps, you have this feature called Analytics Views, which allows you to show various data sets to Power BI. And recently, Power BI announced that there's actually a GitHub connector in preview as well. So you can actually create reports like this that show data from both Azure Boards, stroke Azure DevOps, and GitHub as well. So it's quite handy if, for example, you want to see who did what work in the repository during a sprint. And I'll actually put a link to a post about that in this chat so that we can move forwards with this session.
Okay, well, I think the decision is made and we'll use the Azure Boards for our work items then.
Right, okay, so the main thing we want you all to take away from this section is that Azure Boards is a very powerful way of managing Scrum or Agile work visually, as I just showed you, especially if you're a product owner. Plus, like we just mentioned, GitHub have just announced GitHub Issues, which is something that's worth keeping an eye out for.
Okay, let's talk about CI/CD pipelines, which is where we're going to build and deploy our deliverables. And the main question is, are we going to use the Azure Pipelines feature or the Github Actions for that?
So before we decide that, Sandra, I think everyone wants to know, how does CI/CD work with SQL Server?
Well, the first thing we need to decide is whether we're going to use state-based or migration-based deployments.
Okay, so what's the main difference between those two, apart from the fact that we're only going to demo state-based migrations in this session?
Well, state-based will deploy something in its entirety. So you have your project, and the project is the one source of truth. There's no other version of it, and as soon as you deploy that, the processes behind the project will look for all the differences, create a script, and then deploy that in its entirety. With migration-based, it's a little bit different. You start at one point in the project, and then along the way you get releases, and you have to. And these releases are in sequence, so you have to deploy them in the same sequence that they were made. And it's fair. With state-based, it's pretty easy to create such a pipeline for SQL Server, as I can actually demonstrate right now. So I will take over the screen. You can see my code, right?
Yeah.
So when I had to create a lot of projects for one of my previous employers, I had to do this for like 30 to 40 databases. And anybody who ever created such a solution for a database project knows that you have to create a solution and then put one or more projects in there, and it's just a lot of work. So what I did was I created a template using the PowerShell module called PS Module Development. And this is part of the PS framework. And both modules, by the way, are available on the PS Gallery for free. And with that, I was able to create a template and create all those projects in a matter of minutes. And this is a lot of code, and it downloads the project from my GitHub page and everything. But the most important part is the invoke PSMD template. It needs a template name, an output path, and a name. And if I do that and create a project, it will download the project. Of course, you don't need to download it every single time, but you would have the latest version. And while I'm talking, it already created that project for me. So let's open that. And luckily, this time it opens in the correct window right away. So it has two different projects within the solution. One for the data model. This is the name of the database that I gave it. And then one for the unit tests, because unit tests are important for databases. From here, I only have to import the database once. So I can just you would go to a production database, for instance, connect this version. I'm just going to use the object type and then say import. And that is about it that you need to do to get your databases in source control. And the nice thing about this project is, and I will demo this later on if we have enough time, is that this comes along with both a Azure DevOps pipeline and a GitHub Actions workflow immediately generated for you. So if you don't want to create that pipeline all manually, it can just do that for you. You can just use that template right away, and it will test everything for SQL Server 2017 and 2019. So just to make it easy for you.
All right, so I can go back to the screen here now. That sounds quite handy. So since I'm sure I just heard you mention it just now, what about unit tests?
Well, the thing we can do, there's a couple ways we can do unit testing. I prefer using tSQLt, which is a free unit testing framework for SQL Server. And I prefer that above the other unit testing frameworks because I don't need to learn another language like C#, or I can even do unit testing with Pester with PowerShell. But I'd like with tSQLt, you keep the developer in the tSQLt bubble. But creating unit tests is a lot of work. And when I wanted to do it, I noticed that I did a lot of repetitive stuff because I want tests for object existence. Does my table have the correct columns with the correct data types? Does my store procedure have the correct parameters with the correct data types? Do I have all the indexes, etc., etc., etc.? So what I did was I created a PowerShell module called the PSTSQLt test generator. And this is also available on the GitHub or on the PowerShell gallery. And you can just install this with install module. And what this does is it will look at your database and then pull out all the objects and generate tests for them. And the most important command is this one, invoke PSTG test generator. And if I run that, I can just, it will look at my database and then generate that.
That sounds good. And this is all on the README in this repository in GitHub as well on how to do this, isn't it?
Yeah. So,
good.
And after that, you can just import it in your project, and it will get it gets tested right in there. So, yeah, that's it. Unit testing for you.
That's brilliant. And I think now I will quickly go through both the different services. We'll go through Azure Pipelines and GitHub Actions and make the choice from there. So let me just go back to the screen a moment. And I'm just going to return Azure DevOps seamlessly for everybody. So in Azure DevOps, it has a service called Azure Pipelines, which comes with default services, as you can see on the left-hand side here, which is starts off with pipelines and environments, where you can set environment settings. Releases is what's called a legacy base release format, basically in a GUI way. You have libraries where you can create what's called variable groups, so you can collectively put a group of variables together, and you can actually link these variable groups to key thought secrets instead. You got task groups where you can group common tasks together. It can be quite useful, and deployment groups, which we won't focus on too much here because it's used with the classic editor. And to give you all a bit of a quick history lesson, basically, when Azure DevOps first came out, there used to be two separate parts you would use to do your builds and releases, which were literally called builds and releases. And they were both GUI based. However, Microsoft decided that they wanted to introduce YAML CI/CD pipelines to do all of the CI/CD. So they replaced what was builds with the feature you see now as pipelines. However, which is all YAML based. However, you can still create GUI pipelines as well if you really want to by using the classic editor. However, and I think Sander agrees with me here, YAML is pretty much the way forward, so it's very much worth spending the time and effort getting used to that especially since these other features, apart from releases, have changed over time to be more useful with YAML pipelines.
Yeah, and by the way, GitHub doesn't even use a GUI editor; it's only YAML. So, by the way, Github Actions is heavily being developed by both GitHub and the community. If we have any repositories in GitHub, it makes kind of sense to put our pipeline closer to the repository, in my opinion. And it appears to have a lot of support for various services already. The only downside is that it doesn't support Synapse for as far as I know.
It doesn't support Synapse, no?
Yeah.
Okay, because I think you find it does. If I actually go back to the right search link, and I actually type this in correctly, copied and pasted there. So as you can see here,
nice.
There is actually a GitHub action to do it.
So in that case, a decision is made. We will use GitHub Actions on one condition.
And what's that?
You have to demo it working with the SQL Server deployments.
I'm guessing you actually want me to do this demo right now, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay then. So, as luck would have it, I happen to have an Azure Data Studio open, and it has a local copy of the repository that's in GitHub. So let me just make a change. I'm just going to save here. The source control, by the way, everybody, this is Azure Data Studio. If you've not seen this yet, this is an alternative to SQL Server Management Studio. It offers some slightly different features, including being able to manage database projects in a different way, as well as supporting notebooks as well. And it is worth looking into. So I'm just going to commit this change, and this just commits it to the local copy of my repository. Usually I just click on the ellipsis and select sync to synchronize the changes between both. But as somebody highlighted to me earlier, you can actually click on the icon down here instead. So I'm just going to do that. Let's go to actual GitHub Actions, and you can see a GitHub action is running at the moment, Sandra. So if I click on there, it will open it up. Now, before everybody goes to try and zoom in, please don't strain your eyes here, because what happens is by default, when you start a new workflow, GitHub tries to show it's all running in this small frame. However, they do also provide a nice way for you to zoom in and pan around. So I really like this. So what I did, Sandra, I took the build and unit testing stages that come by default with your tooling, and I added a few extra bits, extra jobs, I should say. For those who work with Azure DevOps, you can think of jobs along the same line as stages. Sandra is going to cover that in a minute. So from there, I created 3 environments for us to deliver the SQL Server update to as well, which are integration, staging, and production. So integration is where you tend to do your integration tests or any changes you make works with our applications. Staging is also known usually as UAT, and that's where you tend to do your user acceptance test. And then, of course, production is the production environment. And that worked. So I did a couple of other little experiments from there. So first of all, I went to synchronize it with an Azure DevOps repository, and I got that working fine. So I thought, well, by default, if you create a DAT pack, as we do in the build stage here, for SQL Server 2019, that doesn't work by default if we went to deploy that same DAT pack to Azure SQL Database. So I had the idea of making a copy of our repository behind the scenes and then converting it so that it'd be able to create a DAT pack to deploy to Azure SQL Database without having to have multiple copies of the same database project. So I actually managed to do that here, as you can see. The main things to realize is that, yeah, I have a batch of SQL running here. It copies the database project that we created in this repository to another destination. And then it changes one line in the SQL proj file to change its target to be for an Azure SQL database. And then scrolling down from there, it builds a new DAT pack based on the new project that we've got a secure copy of. And then it publishes it as a separate artifact to be able to be deployed to Azure SQL databases. And if I scroll down here, as you can see, Sander, I was actually able to do the same for an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool. And for those of you who've never seen how one looks, here is a dedicated SQL pool, which has a database within it, which uses exactly the same schema as what we've got in our GitHub repository. All we did was make a secure copy of the project and change its target to be for Azure SQL Data Warehouse instead. So what do you think of that, Sander?
Well, that's all good and stuff, but can we do something like approvals like we can do with Azure DevOps?
Indeed. So if I just go to the separate tab a minute, and this is environment settings, which you actually find in the settings section, and you just scroll down and there it is. And as you can see, we actually, if I go back to the main environments bit, we have one environment set up at the moment for production, which means that me or you have to review it, and we can set a wait timer as well. And I think this is where you are going to do a very quick comparison. We have 9 minutes left.
Do we have enough time for that?
Probably not, but for the benefit of everybody, I will put in the link for the GitHub workflow syntax instead, so we can carry on with the rest of this session. If you want the Azure DevOps syntax, then obviously feel free to look in your favorite search engine, and it's under YAML schema is what you need to look for.
They're quite similar, so you'll probably make it work.
Yeah. So if we are using GitHub Actions, then we'd have to use Github Runners. And basically the bottom line is, because we're going to be connecting the GitHub Runners on our network, we're going to have to connect in the SQL servers on our network. And because of our network setup, we're going to have to install and create GitHub Runners locally. There is actually a section, some documentation we have on how you can create those images yourself. So we shall put the link in the chat for you all there. And it's for those running, it's exactly the same image for Azure DevOps agents or GitHub Runners. And now Sander's looking at me because we may have skipped a little bit in this part.
Well, I suppose you're going to tell me that we're better off running this as a service, right?
Well, it depends. If you're running it on a dedicated server for use, then yeah, just put it as a service and off you go. But if you're like us too, and you do a lot of testing with Azure DevOps agents and GitHub Actions runners, then you may be better off just installing each one separately in different folders and running them manually whenever you need to, like so, as you can see on the screen here. Now, I know we can do automated tests in GitHub Actions, and we've just seen, for example, that we can do unit tests within a workflow, and people can set out using your tooling by default as well, using tSQLt. However, before we dive too deeply into this topic, can I make a suggestion about how we do our manual tests?
Manual tests? What's that?
Well, since we have the right licenses, I propose we use Azure Test Plans, because we've already decided to use Azure Boards, and Azure Test Plans works with it nicely.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, I will very, very quickly show you now. So if we go back into Azure DevOps, here's Azure Test Plans. It comes with various features that you can use. Test Plans is the main one you'll work with, and the rest of the features support it. Here is an example of a test plan. So, and I've got a test case inside here. And if I click for run for web application, these are easy to create and define, by the way, with experimentation. However, what we can do, and this is why I suggest we use this, is that if we find a problem, we can easily raise a bug in Azure Boards. So if we just fill out the sections here, we will be able to raise this in Azure Boards. And that's it. Cool. That's my main proposition. So I think to save time, we just agree to work with Azure test plans. Deal?
Yeah. So we better briefly discuss the packages here, because I think that's going to be a tough call.
Yeah, in Azure DevOps, you use Azure Artifacts to share things like NuGet packages with others. Yeah. For example, you can share NuGet packages within your organization and things like that.
Yeah, and to remove some jargon for you, you basically have a feed, and a feed is a source that people can access to download packages, which can be online or somewhere on your network. And for Linux-oriented people, it's basically a repository. And these feeds can be configured to host a variety of packages like NuGet, npm, Python, Maven, and universal packages.
Yeah, universal packages is basically for ideal for if you have large binaries that you want to share in your organization. I think Microsoft tested it up to 1 terabyte. We have 4 minutes left, by the way, Sander. Do you want to quickly say about the GitHub side of it?
Yeah, so we can upload packages in GitHub using packages. Again, it supports something like all kinds of packages like NuGet packages and Docker images. We can do even stuff like importing DBA tools, for instance, as a package.
That sounds good. Well, I'm guessing that we should look, since I look to stick with using the packages in GitHub for now.
Yeah.
Until we look to update. So to be honest with you, there are other features in both Azure DevOps and GitHub that we can look to use if we're working this kind of way. And as my t-shirt says, we don't accept the defaults. So for example, we can do things like we can use the dashboard in Azure DevOps to monitor sprints and put a big giant sprint guide up for everybody. And this can tie in with what we're doing with Azure Boards. And in addition, there is the analytics views, which I covered earlier. All of these metrics basically you can use in Power BI as separate data sets.
Don't forget the wiki.
Oh yeah, so
you can use the wiki in either product, in GitHub or in Azure DevOps. I think we should use GitHub's wiki purely for anything important for those repositories. For now, it's probably a better idea to use it to document the way of working with Azure DevOps. That way, we can easily link any work items we raise that are connected to it.
Yeah. And also there are mobile apps available as well for both services. However, I do have to admit I prefer the GitHub one.
Yeah. So remember that everybody is eligible to create their own private Azure DevOps and GitHub organization to test things on, just in case you want to test things without the fear of breaking your company's organizations.
Yep. And finally, just to confirm what we have decided in this session, then, Sandra, we're going to use the following services and features within GitHub and Azure DevOps. So we're going to use Azure Boards and Azure DevOps to manage our work items. GitHub for our repositories, which should also talk back to Azure Boards and can integrate with them. Then we're going to use GitHub Actions for our CI/CD deployments. And we've agreed to use GitHub packages for now until such time as we may need to work with large binaries, and then we'll have to look at using Azure Artifacts. We're going to use Azure Test Plans to manage our manual tests. And then finally, we're going to use Power BI to measure our metrics, because that's one part of working with DevOps, is that you have to manage how you're going to look at your metrics, because as we mentioned earlier, we can connect data from both Azure Boards and GitHub repositories to be used in one Power BI report.
So now we've covered about every feature that we want to use. Where shall we begin?
Well, I suggest we start by getting both teams together and explain to them what we're trying to achieve, because it's very important to get the team on board.
Well, anyway, that's all we've got time for today. We just made it to 60 minutes. Wow. So are there any questions? If there's still a few minutes left.
And if anybody, please give us feedback. I'm sure Kai has got the information on how feedback should be provided. It's very important for me and Sander, so we can take this on board. And if Kai lets us show this last slide, here's our contact details in case you need to reach out to any of us.
Sure. I have a question, basically. It's a question that I often get asked myself, and I'm very happy to have the experts for here. This often get asked, what's the difference between the Azure DevOps and GitHub? So, or when should I pick what? I mean, we also talked a bit about this now before, but just if I get asked, what should one answer in this? Maybe directly.
As we were talking about in this session, because obviously sometimes you have to use both of them together or separately. If you're using, for example, GitHub repositories already, then obviously it makes sense potentially to use GitHub Actions in GitHub and just stay to using GitHub. However, like we said explained in this session, there are pros and definitely benefits of both products. For example, working with work items in Azure DevOps, as you've seen, is in reality very, very, I won't say leagues ahead, but you can do quite a lot with Azure Boards. And if you want to manage your manual tests as well, in the same product, you can use Azure Test Plans. So if you're looking to manage work items with everything as well in an optimal way, maybe Azure DevOps may be a good route. What you may have seen earlier, or some of you may have seen earlier as well, is that when you use Azure Pipelines, you can actually use GitHub as a source for those pipelines. So you can actually have your GitHub repository still in place and then use Azure Pipelines with it. And that's an option. So yeah, and it also most of the time, to be honest, the decision to use one of these services or the other is down to your company strategy. So large enterprises, for example, they are normally the ones that will, if you're working in a large enterprise, then somebody usually has the final say about which of the two products to use.